Hello, this is Father Nature, and this is a bedtime story. Today's story is titled The Tale of Mrs. Ladybug by Arthur Scott Bailey. Chapter 1 The Polka Dot Lady. Little Mrs. Ladybug was a worker. Nobody could deny that. To be sure, she had to stop now and then to talk to her neighbors because Mrs. Ladybug dearly loved a bit of gossip. At the same time, there wasn't anyone in Pleasant Valley that helped Farmer Green more than she did. She tried her hardest to keep the trees in the orchard free from insects. Some of her less worthy neighbors were known sometimes to say, with a sniff, if Mrs. Ladybug didn't enjoy her work, she wouldn't care about helping Farmer Green. And if she hadn't such a big appetite, she would stop to chat even more than she does now. Well, that might seem an odd remark unless one happened to know Mrs. Ladybug freed the orchard of the tiny pests that attacked it. The truth of the matter was this: Mrs. Ladybug ate the little insects that fed upon the fruit trees. Her constant toil meant that she devoured huge numbers of Farmer Green's enemies. Goodness knows what Farmer Green would have done had Mrs. Ladybug and all her family lost their taste for that kind of fare. The orchard might have been a sorry sight. Perhaps it was only to be expected that Mrs. Ladybug should have little patience with folk that seemed lazy. She thought that Freddie Firefly wasted too much of his time dancing in the meadow at night. She considered Buster Bumblebee, the queen's son, to be a useless idler, dressed in his black velvet and gold, having heard that Daddy Longlegs was a harvestman. She urged him to go to work for Farmer Green at harvest time, and as for the beautiful Betsy Butterfly, Mrs. Ladybug found all manner of fault with her. Nothing made Mrs. Ladybug angrier than to see Betsy Butterfly flitting from flower to flower in the sunshine, followed by her admirers. What can they see in that gaudy creature? Mrs. Ladybug often asked her friends. It will appear from this that Mrs. Ladybug wasn't always as pleasant as she might have been. Moreover, she was something of a busybody and too fond of prying into the affairs of others. And if she didn't happen to approve of the neighbors or their ways, Mrs. Ladybug never hesitated to speak her mind. When she first appeared on Farmer Green's place, wearing her bright red gown with its black spots, everyone supposed that Mrs. Ladybug was dressed in her working clothes, and indeed she was, nor did she ever done any other. "I have no time to fritter away," she declared when somebody asked her what she was going to wear to Betsy Butterfly's party. "If I go to the party, I will just drop in for a few minutes as I am, in my polka dot." Her neighbors thought that very strange. They even whispered to one another that they didn't believe Mrs. Ladybug had anything else to wear. Nor had she, nor did she want any. And it wasn't long before everybody understood Mrs. Ladybug's ways. She was so earnest that they couldn't help liking her, no matter if her remarks were a bit tart now and then. Chapter 2 Buster's Resolve. Not only was Betsy Butterfly a beautiful creature, she was pleasant to everybody, and almost all her neighbors were just as pleasant to her. Mrs. Ladybug was one of the few that were sometimes disagreeable to Betsy, for Mrs. Ladybug did not approve of her. She thought that Betsy Butterfly was frivolous, and she frowned whenever she saw Betsy in her beautiful costume. She never wears working clothes, Mrs. Ladybug often complained when talking to her friends. Now, if Betsy Butterfly would only wear something plain and serviceable, as I do, once in a while, people might have a different opinion of her. She ought to try this hard, finished red and black polka dot of mine. It's a wonderful piece of goods. One day, Mrs. Ladybug was gossiping in that fashion with Medible Moth, a soberly clad person who always a bit jealous of a gorgeous Betsy. And Medible Moth nodded her head to everything that little Mrs. Ladybug said. "What do you think of Betsy Butterfly's wings?" Miss Moth inquired. "They're all for show," Mrs. Ladybug declared. "They are so flimsy and delicate that Betsy Butterfly never dares venture out in bad weather. Of what use I'd be to Farmer Green if I had wings like hers? If I stayed under cover whenever the sun didn't shine, Orchid would soon be overrun with insects." Now, it happened that Buster Bumblebee was slipping nectar from a head of clover nearby. Of course, he wasn't listening to what Mrs. Ladybug and Miss Moth were saying, but he couldn't help hearing their remarks. And being a great admirer of Betsy Butterfly, he wasn't at all pleased. He was even buzzed near the two gossipers and said to them, "Can't you find something else to talk about?" "Such rudeness!" Mrs. Ladybug gasped. "What shocking manners!" cried Miss Medible Moth. They hoped that Buster Bumblebee heard what they said. Anyhow, he flew off his blundering, clumsy way without speaking to them again. "Who is this Mrs. Ladybug to pick flaws in this beautiful Betsy Butterfly?" he asked himself savagely. "Who is she to find fault with Betsy's lovely wings? If Mrs. Ladybug herself had wings, I shouldn't think her chatter so strange. But a person with no wings has no business expressing his views of somebody else." Buster Bumblebee was so out of patience with Mrs. Ladybug that he lost his taste for clover heads for the rest of the afternoon. And that was a most unusual thing with him. However, he could think of nothing but Mrs. Ladybug and her unkind speeches. And at least, meeting Betsy Butterfly herself along towards sunset, he stopped to tell how well she was looking and how charming her colors were. Betsy Butterfly was not vain. She laughed gaily and said, "You're very kind to say these agreeable things." "I couldn't help it," he replied heartily. "Everybody's not like you," Betsy Butterfly told him. "Then you've been hearing about Mrs. Ladybug," he cried. "Somebody has been tattling." "It doesn't matter," Betsy Butterfly assured him. "Perhaps it's good for me to know that everyone doesn't admire me." Buster Bumblebee did not agree with her. "I'll have to speak to Mrs. Ladybug," he declared. "Oh, don't," Betsy Butterfly begged him, as she was beautiful and never wanted people to quarrel on her account. But Buster Bumblebee had made up his mind, and nothing could change it. Hidden Wings. The next day, Buster Bumblebee set out for the orchard to find Mrs. Ladybug. He wanted to warn her to stop talking about Betsy Butterfly. But Buster hadn't realized that it wasn't an easy matter to say anything to Mrs. Ladybug. Mrs. Ladybug always liked to do most of the talking herself. She preferred to let others listen. He found her hard at work destroying insects on an old apple tree. And when she caught sight of him, Mrs. Ladybug paused in her labors. "Well, young man," she exclaimed, looking at Buster severely, "are you idling this lovely day away? You don't seem to be making any honey." Buster wished that he hadn't spoken first. He certainly had no intentions of discussing such matters as honey making. "I don't need to make honey," he told Mrs. Ladybug. "The workers in our hive provide honey enough. Maybe you didn't know that I am of royal blood. I'm the queen's son. I don't have to work. I don't have to do anything," he declared somewhat hotly. "Rubbish!" cried Mrs. Ladybug, regarding him with a frown. "Go get yourself some working clothes. Take off your back velvet and gold and save the suit for best." You don't understand. Being a queen's son, I'm expected to wear my court costume every day. Nonsense. The sooner you get such silly notions out of your head, the better off you'll be. Everybody ought to work. Too much play is bad for folks. Buster Bumblebee could feel himself flushing. The neighbors were not expected to address a queen's son in that fashion. "That's exactly the way you talk about Bitsy Butterfly," he exploded. "Huh?" Mrs. Lady sniffed. "You're a worthless spare. Bitsy Butterfly's wings—" At the point, Buster managed to interrupt her. "Don't talk about wings, please. Who are you to talk about wings when you haven't any yourself?" Mrs. Ladybug started, and she gave him a queer look. "What's that? What's that? Say that again." "You haven't any wings." "Oh, you are mistaken. I have wings." "Oh, then you left them at home." Mrs. Ladybug smiled, a very knowing sort of smile. When she saw it, Buster Bumblebee couldn't help feeling uncomfortable. Somehow he knew that he had blundered, but just where he had erred, he was unable to decide. "Watch sharp, young sir. Watch sharp, and perhaps you'll be able to learn something." Then Buster Bumblebee received the surprise of his life as he watched little Mrs. Ladybug open her shell-like black dotted red, black, and spread a pair of delicate brown wings. "See these? I've really two pair of wings because my polka dot wing covers are actually wings too. Only folks don't usually call them by that name." Having spread her wings, Mrs. Ladybug decided to take a short flight, and with Buster gazing duly after her, she flitted off. "I have to tell my mother, the queen, about this." I think this is a good way to end this chapter. Maybe we could continue it at a later time. Good night.